A pleasant afternoon to all my peers and mentors from different and wonderful cultures of our society. So, as you know, our mains 2020 has gathered full stream, and today we have gathered here to discuss paper 2 or general studies paper 1. Now, writing 4,000 words in 3 hours is very distressing, and my work has already been cut out because it is my responsibility to do a full-fledged analysis and not just tell you what to write here and there. So even if this session gets prolonged a bit, kindly bear with me. So from here forth, without any further ado, let's start. So we are discussing the rock cut architecture. So the important keywords which we need to recognize here is the rock cut architecture and knowledge of Indian art and history. So in a way we have to link the rock cut architecture from the art and history. Now this is the keyword which is important, discuss. Now when we talk about the keyword discuss, it encompasses all the aspects and we can give both the positive and negative arguments, but we have to justify the reasons for those. So it is a straightforward question, basically how we say that the rock cut architecture is an indication of early Indian art and history. So what is rock cut architecture? Rock cut architecture is basically any building, monument or complex developed by excavating the natural rocks or solid rocks in its natural form. So rock cut architecture, now here after the introduction you can straight away go to the points. So first point you can mention is the earliest caves were the Barabar caves from 3rd century BC. Now I know many of you might be wondering why I haven't started the discussion on the caves by the Bhimbetka caves. Now according to me, Bhimbetka caves is not a part of rock cut architecture. It was a cave shelter which consisted of prehistoric hieroglyphs and petroglyphs, that is essentially cave painting. So according to me, we should start with Barabar caves. These were in Bihar. Next, from 2nd century BC onwards, we find the modern art and architecture, and there many caves were excavated for the Buddhist shrines and monasteries, and from there on we can see that the Buddhist missionaries were associated with a lot of traders and merchants who traveled across the world and in the mission of propagation of Buddhism, and these evidences can be recognized by the fact of, that is, Karle caves, then Ellora caves, Ajanta caves and Kanheri caves. So this is also an important piece of architecture. Then we can talk about now after the 2nd century BC, with the fall of the Mauryan Empire, so there was less patronage to the Buddhists and thereby it declined, and due to the persecution by kings such as Pashyamitra Shunga, the Buddhist monks, they started taking refuge in the Andhra dynasty. So there we seek various examples of the Buddhist caves and monasteries in Deccan, Western Deccan. Then from the 3rd century CE, we find a significant decline in the Buddhist monasteries because of the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, which were basically focused on the motifs and the symbols instead of building sculptures. And in the 6th century BCE, the Buddhism monuments were gradually revived with the completion of the caves of Ajanta and Ellora. When finally Hinduism descended upon the subcontinent and it occupied the place, and lone standing temples were developed. Now by the 12th century, we can find the Kailash temple at Ellora, which was built by the Rashtrakuta kings, and this reflected the peak of the rock cut architecture, and we can link Indian art and history with this rock cut architecture. Then although in the conclusion we can say that although in the 21st century also small Buddhist sites continue to be excavated, so these tell us the importance of the early Indian art and history, which is continuously being reflected by the rock cut architecture. So with this we move on to the next question. Now Pala period. Now here the directive word is enumerate. Enumerate basically means whatever the points you have in mind, whatever the elaboration, or we have to just say, we have to discuss why it was the most significant phase and what contribution, how the Pala period contributed to the development of the Buddhism. So we can start with, first of all, in the introduction we can write that the Pala were Buddhist rulers in the part of Bengal, and they ruled from 8th century CE to 12th century CE. Now we can start discussing the points. One, we can write about Dharampal. Now Dharampala, he had a spiritual preceptor, Haribhadra. So these both were responsible for the propagation of Buddhism. Then Dharampala was also responsible for the creation of Vikramshila monastery and Sompura Mahavihara, which is in present day Bangladesh. Then we can write that there was in the initial period, in the ancient period, the islands of Malaysia, the Malaysian Peninsula and the Java and Sumatra Islands were known as Suvarnadweep, and its king Balaputra Dev, he helped in erecting a monastery in Nalanda, and he asked the king, the Pala king at that time, to donate 5 villages for its maintenance. Then we can write about the sculptures which were made at that time. Now sculptures will include these, basically during this Pala time, the Buddhist sculptures, they assumed a rigid posture with closed legs, closed nearby legs, and the important thing is these statues or sculptures had multiple arms. So these multiple arms allowed them to represent various mudras. So that is an important landmark in the history of Buddhism, which was reflected by the Pala period. And one more point we can mention about the paintings. Paintings were normally drawn on vellum paper. Now, since the Buddhist monks advocated the philosophy of non-violence, so basically there was stipulation to coconut and banana leaves. So all these examples, 1 or 2 examples, if they come to your mind, you can also, and you have to elaborate on this. Easily you can write this answer in 150 words. So what we have to write in conclusion, that we can write in conclusion that it was the Pala architecture, it advanced the early Bengali civilizations, and it is still reflected in the Tibetan Buddhism. One more you can also write. There were Buddhist missionaries like Atisha who traveled to places such as Tibet to propagate Buddhism. So this is the basic crux of the question, and this is the way in which we can answer. Moving on. One thing we can also do, if we mark the places of importance, here we can say that These were the locations of Nalanda and Barabar. Then we can show Ajanta caves here. We can show the Ellora, that is basically the Rashtrakuta kings. Then we have the Karle. Now Ellora, I have drawn this symbol because it was a confluence of all the three important Jainism, Buddhism and Hinduism religion. So these things we can, if you have time only, just you can mention this on a, like you can draw a rough map of India and you can just draw this. So I'll just erase this. Now we'll move on to the next third question. Now evaluate the policies of Lord Curzon and they're long. Now evaluate, the directive word here is evaluate, in which you have to pass a sound judgment about the statement. So what we have to evaluate the policies, we have to pass a sound judgment on policies and we have to reach on the conclusion that these policies, were they really responsible for influencing the national movement in any way? And then we have to substantiate or elaborate those policies. So starting we can say that Lord Curzon's reign of 7 years, that is 1898 to 1905, was full of commissions, omissions and missions. So what happened was he insulted the intelligentsia and the nationalists, and their activities he termed as just letting go of the gas. So in this way you can give a unique introduction. Then we just straight away come to its policies. So first policy was the Universities Act, (1904). So this was the consequence of the Raleigh Commission of 1902. So on the basis of Raleigh Commission, the Universities Act was passed by the government, which gave greater control to the government. Now this was justified by Lord Curzon as to make the education in the country more efficient, but actually it was a disguise to make the intelligentsia and the educated people more loyal towards the British administration. Then we have Calcutta Corporation Act of 1899. So by this, what he did was he reduced the power of the legislative assemblies and he restricted the nationalist leaders from taking part in the political activities. Then we can talk about the Official Secrets Act 1904. Now this is still relevant today also. A lot of happenings have been going on in the current scenario. Now this was basically to muzzle or restrict or shut down the voices which criticize the British administration, so nationalist publication. And most important of all is the partition of Bengal in 1905. This was a watershed movement in the nationalist politics because it expanded or spanned all the nooks and corners of the country, and it involved the participation for the first time of children, women and all other societies. So these points you can easily complete 150 words, and in the conclusion we can write that in a letter to the Secretary of State in 1900, Lord Curzon said that the Indian National Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my ambitions while in India is to assist it to its peaceful demise. But the long-term implication was not the demise of India, but it paved the way for the rise of an independent India. Now discuss the geophysical characteristics of Circum-Pacific Zone. Again, the keyword is discussed. We have in one of the previous questions we have discussed the directive word, so we have to just lay down and give for and against arguments, but here we have just to enumerate the points. So circum-Pacific zone. First of all, geophysical, what does this term mean? Geophysical is basically refers to the activities or the structure or the physical features of the Earth's interior or its vicinity. Then circum-Pacific zone. Circum-Pacific zone or the circum-Pacific region or belt, or also called the Ring of Fire, is a ring along the Pacific Ocean which consists of more than 450 active volcanoes and consists of 90% of the active earthquakes. So it's a geography based question. It would be wise to make a diagram. I'll just try to draw a rough diagram. So pretty basic diagram, not that much is advanced. So anyways, here we can make New Zealand also. So rough diagram, this is Russia, Asia, then this is North America, South America, Australia. So this is the Pacific Ocean, and basically what I want to discuss is now circum-Pacific. We have already discussed the introduction. So why it is called a circum-Pacific zone or the Ring of Fire? Basically, it is a confluence of various tectonic plates or lithospheric plates which converge with each other. That is why, due to subduction, these volcanic activities occur. So if I draw so this is basically the Pacific plate, then this is the Juan de Fuca plate, this is Cocos, this is Nazca, this is Philippines plate. So basically, if I draw the convergence, so here this is converging, this is converging, this is converging. Now this is an exception because this is a transform boundary, the San Andreas fault. Then here we have some diverging boundaries. Here you can see certain rise or ridges which we witness. So based on this you can find out the various characteristics. Now another thing, if we mention some of the volcanoes, so here we have Mount Merapi, here we have Krakatau, then here we have Mount St. Helens, this is Popocatepetl, this is near Ecuador, Cotopaxi. Then in Philippines we can Pinatubo or Mount Taal. So all these things can be, all these mountains can be measured, my diagram is not that nice, but you can draw a rough diagram and show all this. And basically, so one point you can write about about the subduction, that is which leads to the volcanic activities. Next you can write about, the next point you can write about the exception, about the transform faults. Now transform faults it is different from the convergent boundary in a way that transform faults. Here the plates move parallel or sideways to each other, so they scrape against each other, and this is a hotspot for earthquakes, massive earthquakes. And next you can write about trenches. Trenches such as this is the Aleutian Trench, this is the Japanese Trench, then Philippines Trench, here is the Mariana Trench, then here is the Peruvian Trench. So trenches are there because when we draw the diagram of a subduction plate, so like this is a subducting plate and this is lithosphere. So when one of the plates is subducting, the oceanic plate is subducting because it is heavier than the continental plate. So what happens is it gives rise to this gap here, it is known as the trench, and as the plate subsides, the material here comes in contact with the hot mantle or the asthenosphere, and this gives rise to mantle plumes which ultimately manifest themselves in the form of volcanoes. So these three features, and ultimately in conclusion we can write that that the Circum-Pacific zone is an important way by which we can study the interior of the earth. Now, process of desertification does not have climatic boundaries. Justify. Now when we come to justify, again if we are giving a for argument, we have to justify it with reasons. If we are giving an against argument, we have to basically give the reason for we have to delve into the topic, and we have to justify this statement that either desertification goes beyond climatic boundaries, or it is restricted to the climatic boundaries. Now climatic boundaries, that desertification, the deserts of our world, they normally occur between the latitudes of 15 degrees to 30 degrees north and south, which constitutes the subtropical high pressure belt. So the reasons can be basically the offshore trade winds or the cold currents or the rain shadow areas. So examples can be the Sonoran Desert near Mexico and California, then the West Australian Desert, then we have in the southern hemisphere the Kalahari Desert, then we have the Sahara Desert. So normally these deserts are there because these lie in the geographical, that is the climatic boundaries, climate that includes the temperature and precipitation. In these regions, the evaporation and the evapotranspiration is in much excess as compared to the rainfall. So these climatic conditions are justifying its boundaries. But now what is happening is, first we have to define the term desertification. Desertification is actually the expanse of the desert landforms or landscapes beyond the natural desert areas in which they were prior. So when we talk about the Thar Desert is, in the recent past, it is a desert area, but when it is spreading towards Delhi or Haryana, or it is extending the boundary of the Aravallis, then we are discussing about the process of desertification. So according to the government, the percentage of desertification in India, 30% of the geographical area in India is undergoing massive desertification. So with this we can talk about various reasons. First, we can give an example of Burni grasslands in Kutch in Gujarat. So basically these grasslands, these scrublands are undergoing the process of desertification. That is, we can write the common reasons such as overgrazing and high population, which includes the high demand for the crops. One of the reasons, general reasons we can say why desertification occurs, because there is too much pressure on the land. So once we clear the forest for performing agriculture, then the crops, the climatic changes take place, the overgrazing take place, then that region, that arable land, that becomes unfit for cultivation, then we move ahead. So that that land which was earlier arable or which supported cultivation, that has been desertified. Then the other land, the crops, they sustain the crops for some time, and then again we move forward. Then again we can talk about a place, Dhule in Maharashtra, which has become a recent hotspot of desertification. Now the reason for that is basically illegal mining. One example I've already discussed, that is the Aravalis. So Aravalis have they have started to lose their ability to act as a climatic barrier. So the deserts, the Thar desert is slowly expanding towards the Haryana and Delhi areas. So these justify that the desertification does not have climatic boundaries. To conclude, we can give a positive side to it. For example, the government recently proposed a 1,400 kilometer and 5 kilometer green belt stretching from Porbandar in Gujarat to Panipat in Haryana. So it can reduce or alleviate the effects of desertification. It is modeled on the basis of the Green Wall of Africa, which was recently much praised about. It is a green wall similar to this, which is proposed by the Indian government, that extends from Djibouti, from East Africa, to Senegal in West Africa, to prevent the expansion of the Sahel region or the desert area down towards Africa. So by these methods, we can, by sustainable development and involvement of all multi-stakeholders, we can prevent or basically slow down the desertification and possibly reverse its effects. Now moving on to the next question, we have, how will the melting of Himalayan glaciers have a far-reaching impact on the water resources? So we have to link the melting of Himalayan glaciers to the water resources. Now this does not involve any directive words, so it's a straightforward question. So now, according to the reports of the government, the Himalayan glaciers are melting at a much faster pace than even the Hindu Kush region. So we can, in the introduction, we can write a stat that it is decreasing by the extent of 5 to 55% from the period of 2001 to 2011. Already it has done so. So we can include such stat in the introduction. Then we can move on to the points. So first of all, it is predicted that till 2050, the flow in the Himalayan rivers, that will increase. So that will lead to a variety of problems like GLOF, glacial lake outburst flow, that causes a lot of floods. And because of this, the communities, it will engulf the communities in an adverse way. Their livelihood, their water resources, drinking water and sanitation, that will be affected. Then from 2060 onwards, the Himalayan rivers will start losing water, they will start receding. So since they will start receding, water is also used as a source of hydroelectric power. So hydroelectric resource will be reduced, the hydroelectric potential will be reduced. Then we can write, as the rivers, Himalayan rivers recede, the farming resources, the irrigation resources, that will be impacted. Then when we talk about the receding of rivers, less of fresh water is entering the oceans and we will experience more of saline water intrusion. So these are the basic points which we can mention. So in the form of a conclusion, we can write that again, sustainable development, that usual things we write, and involvement of multi-stakeholder approach, and basically climate sustainable practices we have to adopt. So moving on. Okay. Account for the present location of iron and steel industries away. So initially what happened was, in the past, the iron and steel industries, it's a weight losing industry. This implies that an equivalent amount of the product which is produced, that is much lighter relatively to the input constituents that are used. So that is why it was earlier located near to the raw materials such as coal, limestone and iron ores. But as time progressed, we are experiencing a lack of coal resources. We are, so it is making the import services and the logistics services more easier. We are able to find the international market. So we have several factors which we can mention here. One factor is the coastal location. Again, since we are importing raw material from like coal, a good grade coal from Australia and other countries, so we have these coastal locations. For example, we have Vizag and we have Osaka in Japan. Then we have Pittsburgh also near the coast, which is traditionally also, which is traditional steel industry area. Then second we can write is competition. Now these large integrated steel plants like TISCO, Tata Iron and Steel Company, which is located in Jamshedpur. So these are integrated complex in the way that all the processes, the complex processes, that is procurement of the raw material, then processing, smelting, extraction of iron from the ore, then removal of the sludge, and then refining it into pig iron, and finally converting it into iron and steel. These take place in a large area in a integrated complex. So smaller steel plants are being located nearer to the cities. So we can take an example of Bhushan Steel Plant in Delhi. So basically raw material, although Jharkhand is a lot of raw material is locally available, but in these areas they can also recycle the scrap material and they can convert this scrap metal into iron and steel and reduce competition in the same manner. Then we can also write strategic reasons. For example, after World War II, we had the era of Cold War, so USA and USSR decided not to concentrate their industries in a particular region. So they moved their industries towards the coastal areas, like USA moved its industries towards California. Then we can write about technology. Technology like high grade smelters and open hearth technology are there, which make the process of iron and steel, the process of making of iron and steel much easier. So all these techniques are there. So in the conclusion we can write that the initial factors, the factors which determine the location of iron and steel industry, that have moved beyond the traditional factors of land, labor, capital and location. So these factors can be mentioned. Then for instance, I can just show you one or two of these examples you can mark on the map. For example, Vizag is located somewhere here. So Visakhapatnam steel plant is located near the coast. Now it is connected with good highways. This is going up to Chennai. This is NH16. Then it is also traveling all the way to Kolkata. It is well connected to ports. Again NH16. Then river water resources. This is the Godavari and this is Krishna. So water resources are available. Then what about the coal and iron, how it is? Now coal is generally, we can obtain coal from this Bokaro region. Singhbhum is an area of iron. Then we have iron resources in Delhi Rajra in Chhattisgarh, and we have iron resources in Bailadila. Then Bolangir, Koraput in Odisha are sources of manganese. Here Mayurbhunj is an area of iron. Then Singareni in Andhra Pradesh, this is a resource of coal. So all these highways, railway networks and nearness to the coast, so that import and export can take place, all these developments have enabled, or they have expedited the location of iron and steel industries away from the location of raw materials. Now as caste, again we go back to the paper 1 syllabus of social issues. So what do you understand by caste? Caste is basically a social or hierarchical institutional arrangement which is based on criteria such as birth, food habits, occupations, etc. So basically it's a question, so we can either go pro in favor of the argument or against the argument, but whatever arguments we take, we have to elaborate means we have to just delve into the topic and say give the points which support our justification or argument. So has caste lost its relevance in the multicultural society? So first, in the introduction, we can give the definition of caste, then we can give some relevant points. For example, we can give an example of political identities. Although globalization has, to an extent, they have revolutionized the concept of elections. The nota system has been introduced. That is that in that way the caste has lost its relevance. But at the same time, some of the political parties, I'm not going to name them, but some of the political parties in states, they create vote banks based on caste identities. Then economic development. Now, as we all know, various welfare policies have been invoked, or they have been established by the government in order to uplift or alleviate the conditions of the backward sections. But this has also created divisions among the backward sections. So some of the categories of backward sections, some of the people, they have risen above the others, and so that has created an economic problem. Similarly, if we talk about the some of the castes like Jats and Patidars, so they have also they are strong landholders and they possess the necessary resources, but still they are demanding reservation in the face of economic development. Then we can write about social issues. Economic development, how has caste lost its relevance is that we are working, people from different castes are working throughout India in various multinational corporations and industries. So globalization has had a positive impact in that way. Then social issues, we can give a very common example of intercaste marriages because of globalization and in the multicultural Indian society. This intercaste marriages are taking place, but still we see incidences of when we see the matrimonial ads in the newspapers. So there also we see instances of the desire of selecting the brides and grooms on the basis of castes. So in this way we can elaborate on this question and you can give a suitable conclusion. Okay, so this based on COVID-19 had to be in the one of the questions, inequalities and paper 1 poverty, the syllabus comment. So this is a directive word. Now comment gives us again the opportunity to give our suggestion or give our opinion about this statement. So again, we have an option of the option of an overall pro or against argument can be formed, but we have to again give the reasons behind it. So in the introduction, I found a statement. I was reading the paper's introduction. We can say on 8th August 2020, Mukesh Ambani became the fourth richest person in the world, but at the same time, a farm laborer who had lost his job due to the pandemic lockdown. He committed suicide by jumping into the well, and also his three daughters. So that is a grim statement. You can use that. Then we are talking about two types of components, that is class inequalities and poverty. So with class inequalities, we can mention, that is, now we can class inequalities, we can mention about the blue collar jobs. Now basically white collar jobs, the people working in white collar jobs, they have access to the internet and all the facilities from their company, so they can work through Skype and work from home easily, but that is not the case with blue collar jobs. Then we can talk about the low paid laborers and the daily wage earners. Daily wage earners have definitely suffered adversely due to the lockdown and the pandemic. Now low paid workers, they include a variety of occupations such as nursing, policing, and even the businesses which have shut down due to the pandemic and lockdown, like the tourism and hotels and all these recreational activities. So the people who are employed in that, they have been a lot affected a lot. Then we can talk about the educational deprivation. Why is that happening? That is happening because according to the recent, we can give the data, recent national sample survey that said that 24% of the households, they don't have access to the internet connection. So that creates a problem for the students too. That creates it is again an example of class inequality. Then for the wage class inequality, we can also give some of the stats. According to the periodic labor force survey 2017-18, only 50% of the salaried workers have the proper business contracts, and 70% of them don't have the social security benefits. So these stats can be mentioned. So these people, even if they don't attend work for even one day, they are losing their wages. So now we come to poverty. So when we talk about poverty, one is again we can link to education. So for the poor, the poverty is permanent. So education, now the schools have closed down. So those who don't have access to digital education, they have to sustain for themselves. And then even when the school reopens, because in order to make ends meet, whatever losses have been incurred by the poor households, they have to again drop out of school, and again they have to work with their families in order to make ends meet. So this becomes a vicious cycle. And one important point we have recently come across is the economy, even after the pandemic ends, it will take a K-shaped recovery. That is the people with the income in the higher deciles, they will go upwards, and the poor people will they will even dive into further poverty. And according to recent estimates, the per capita GDP has been revised. The per capita growth rate has been revised to -11%. And although recently India became it overtook Nigeria as the persons with affected with extreme poverty. It reduced its numbers less than Nigeria. It is slowly trying to sort of reclaim that position by adding 85 million poor people more. So in the conclusion we can write, even when the pandemic ends, apart from the lives that we have lost, when the germs that will leave this world, it will leave them more unequal than it was when the pandemic arrived. So that is a nice conclusion that you can add. Now again, regionalism we are talking about, it's a direct connection to GS paper 1. So do you agree it's a question we have to argue, so we have to take a stand whether we are pro, like in a debate we take a stand, and in the end we can, in order to present an equipoise argument, we can give a soft kind of conclusion. So again, regionalism, you can start with the definition of regionalism, that is, regionalism is the affiliation to a particular regional identity, which apart from geography it can also include other factors such as the language and culture. So examples: cultural assertiveness. So we can categorize regionalism into various strata. One, we can write about secessionists movement. So recently we have come across the Pathalgadi movement in eastern India. Now they want to govern themselves according to their own laws and customs, separate from the central government or the state government laws. So we can take that example. Then we can talk about supra-state regionalism. In this, more than one state or a group of states, they identify themselves as unique or different from another state or a group of states. For example, the north-south divide is very prominent. So recently there was talking about the United States of South India, where the four major Dravidian states, they sort of coming together and in a way presenting themselves against the authority of the other states. Then we can talk about interstate regionalism. It is very common when we come to water disputes and all, the states become very sensitive in that issue. We can give a recent example of Satluj Yamuna link canal, that is an issue between Punjab and Haryana. Then intra-state regionalism. It is within the a particular state. For example, recently there have been demands to make Kodagu region a union territory. Then we have the extraction of Darjeeling region separately from West Bengal. So these examples can be given and elaborated in 150 words. And in the conclusion, we can say that although we are witnessing these, but if proper aspirations, if the genuine aspirations of the regions, especially in terms of economic development, are met by the government or the authorities, then there will be better competition and better regional development of all, and there will be prosperity in the society. Okay, so now we have arrived at the lengthier questions, 250 words questions. So Indian philosophy and tradition trader. So again, this is an all-encompassing directive, and basically we have to, obviously there is no reason to put an argument against this statement, because definitely Indian philosophy and tradition have played a significant role. Now, basically in the introduction, we can start by saying that the height or the grandeur of any civilization is depicted by the monuments which manifest themselves in the form of the philosophy and tradition. So we can discuss about the Harappa civilization or the Indus Valley civilization. Now, why I have taken the Harappan civilization as an example is because certain examples like the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, they were constructed. So that indicated the tradition of ritualistic bathing and cleansing. Then we can talk about the Mauryan art and architecture. In this, there were two types of categories of art and sculpture, that is the popular art and the court art. Now, court art was due to political and religious reasons, and basically when we come across the pillars, the Sarnath pillar that Ashoka built, so that was to commemorate the victories in the battles which he fought. Then the capital at Pataliputra and Kumrahar are exemplary instances of showing the glory of the kingdom. Then we can come to the post-Mauryan art. This was influenced by the rise of various Brahminical sects like Vaishnavites, Shaktites, and the Vaishnavites, Shaktites, and Shaivites. So these were influenced. For example, Varaha statue is found in Iran. Then we can talk about the Buddhist philosophy and tradition. For example, we can talk about the stupa. In stupa, what happened was it was built basically the dome structure of the funeral cumulus. That was a special place for the Buddhist monks because the ashes and relics of the dead are kept there. So that was a tradition. Then we can talk about the various mudras that were in the associated with Buddhism, like the Bhumi Sparsh mudra. So that has been used in various statues and sculptures. Then we can talk about the Hindu temples. Now when we talk about the Hindu temples, some characteristics like the murti, the garbhagriha or the womb, and later on when the shikharas arrived, so these like mandapas, all these traditions or philosophies were unique to this Hindu temples. These were the basic constituents. Then we can talk about here the Sanatan Dharma philosophy on which these temples were based, all these sculptures were based. Then we can talk about the Khajuraho school, built by the Chandel rulers. Now basically these were materialistic. These monuments and sculptures were inspired by Vatsyayana's philosophy of Kama Sutra, and these were erotic in nature. These were north facing or east facing, and moreover they supported the Charvaka philosophy of materialism. Then we can say that they were contrary to the Adi philosophy of Adi Shankaracharya. So all these, then when we come to so we can also discuss about the Odisha architecture. Now Odisha architecture, Jainism was much was given a major fillip or impetus during King Kharavela's reign. Then subsequently Adi Shankaracharya philosophy promoted Hinduism. So in the Odisha architecture we can see a confluence of Jainism, Hinduism and Buddhism. So that we can discuss. Then we can discuss about the Vijayanagara school of art. Now in this Vijayanagara school of art, we see a prominence of secular philosophy or tradition, and it was also related with the political achievements of the kings. So all these examples we can commemorate and reminisce, and we can write. So again we can give an apt conclusion and we can conclude this question. Now again we have to comment or give an opinion that Persian literary sources, they really reflect the spirit of age. Now when we talk about the Persian literature was very prominent. It became prominent with the advent of the Turco-Afghans. So slowly we will start talking about the points. So we can write about the Turco-Afghans first. In this period we can talk about Firdausi's Shahnama, which apart from the Persian empires or the Turkish empires of Central Asia, it also talks about the general customs of the people, the worship, the general secular nature. So then we can talk about the advent of Mughals. Now Gulbadan Begum had written Humayun-Nama on the request of Akbar. So basically what she produced was not only a chronicle of the trials and tribulations of the Humayun, of the empire or the reign of during Humayun. It also talked about the conditions of living in the women quarters of harem, and basically it was a chronicle. It is the only surviving age of Mughal period written by a woman of great royalty in the 16th century. Then we can talk about the Akbar period. Faizi was a renowned poet of that time. Then like Faizi, he translated a mathematical treatise Lilavati into Persian. Then we can talk about Abul Fazl and Ane Akbari and Akbarnama, which basically which basically made sacred the principle of Akbar, that is Sule Kul, or universal monotheism. And so again we see a glimpse of the unity of Hindus and Muslims. We can talk about the Delhi Sultanate period also. A very famous personality, Amir Khusrau, was there. So not only was he a very famous renowned poet, he was also a great historian, and he's credited with the fusion of various languages, that is the Arabic, Turkic, Persian, and all these fusion caused he created a devotional song, Sufi devotional song, that is the Qawwali. Then in Shah Jahan's period, the court historian was Abdul Hamid Lahori. Then he also, he wrote a very famous book known as Padshahnama. So here he not only talks about the reign of Shah Jahan, but also the court activities and the wedding ceremonies. So in this way we can talk about a lot of, even when we go towards Bijapur and Golconda in the southern kingdoms, we arrive at an era of Mahmud Gawan, who patronized the arts and literature. So ultimately in the conclusion we can write that Persian literature, it was a confluence of both the Hindi and the Persian styles, which came to be known as Sabke Hind, that is a style of India, and thus it was a showcase, or it was an exemplification of the unity between the various cultures, especially Hindu and Muslims. Okay, so we have modern India. Discuss again, there is a directive word. So 1920s, the third decade of the 20th century, it was a great watershed movement. The various ideologies came into being, and one important event was the non-cooperation movement. Now, why it is important? Because it gave an impetus to the political atmosphere in the country, and it also invited the participation of the urban Muslims who were earlier absent. But later on in the movement, with the division of the Khilafat issue and dissatisfaction of the Muslim leaders with the Congress participation, it ultimately communalized the situation or the scenario of the country to an extent. Then we have Swaraj Party. Now, few members of the Indian National Congress, such as Ajmal Khan and Motilal Nehru, they were critical of the Congress method of constructive work and non-participation or boycott, which was started in the by the non-cooperation movement. Ideally, they formed the Swaraj Party. They were of the opinion that it is better to enter the legislative assemblies and expose the political void that the British had created, and use that void to exploit Indians. Then we can talk about the rise of Marxism and socialism. Now, after the failure of the non-cooperation movement, many young individuals like S.C. Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru, they were unsatisfied with the progress, and they, influenced by the Soviet Revolution, they became inclined to a different type of philosophy, that is philosophy both based on the anti-imperialist lines, and they wanted to give a slogan of Purna Swaraj. Then we have the revolutionary terrorism activities. We can give an example of the Hindustan Republican Association. We can also tell about the Yugantar and Anushilan Simati in Bengal, and later on the activities, the revolutionary activities under Surya Sen. Then we can talk about the All India Trade Union movement, trade unionism. All India Trade Union Conference was formed under the guidance of Lala Lajpat Rai, and it was formed in 1920, and M.N. Joshi was responsible for it. In socialism, we can also write about the CPI, Communist Party of India, that is M.N. Roy. It was formed after the second Congress at the Comintern. Then these points we can write, and at the end we can give a suitable conclusion. Some more points, if they come to your mind, you can add. Okay. Now we come to a slightly significantly different, rather directive word. When we are asked to only examine, then we have to study the topic, we have to get into the depth of the topic, and we have to study what are the pros and cons of the basically we have to expedite and utilize our knowledge about the topic. But when we add critically, we have to tell about the good and bad of the topic, and ultimately arrive at a suitable conclusion. So interlinking of rivers, basically in the introduction we can write, it is the process or the project of transferring or sharing the surplus water from the perennial rivers and other surplus basins to the deficit regions. So we will, in this we can divide the things, divide the answer into two parts. That is, first we can talk about the advantages. Now advantages, basically the irrigation in the drought prone areas of Vidarbha in Maharashtra. It has been severely affected by drought for quite some years now. So this will provide the irrigation and prevent the region from experiencing droughts. Then the transfer of water to the peninsular area. It is a drought prone region. Drinking and sanitation facilities can be augmented. Then droughts and floods, in this way you can elaborate a bit on this. Navigation. Obviously, when the water flow in particular rivers will be like we have, we are developing national waterways. So once the surplus water is transferred to the non-perennial rivers, these also can be developed in the form of canals and waterways. So in this way, these can be used for the transport of cargo and passengers. So these are basically the solutions, and disadvantages when we talk about. One is that it cannot be estimated that this interlinking of rivers, when we create dams and reservoirs, how many people will be displaced, and again their rehabilitation is a big problem. One dam which comes particularly to the mind, that is the Tehri Dam in Uttarakhand, which submerged an entire village. So people had to be rehabilitated on a massive, expansive extent. Then we can talk about the wildlife or parks, the ecosystems. A very recent example is the Betwa Cane linking of the river, and on the near the banks of the Cane River there is a Panna National Park. So it is estimated that 4,000 hectares of land of this national park will be affected adversely. And of course, lastly, we have already talked about on in the question on regionalism. Some states like Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Kerala have already objected to the interlinking river project. So in the conclusion, we can write that although this interlinking of rivers, it provides a great opportunity as well as a challenge to augment our sources and deal with the interrelated problems as are given in the statement. But again, we have to take all stakeholders into perspective, into respect, and we have to then proceed accordingly. Okay, we have to give an account for the huge flooding. Now this question on this topic of floods have been repeated, have getting repeated over several years. So what approach I have taken is to avoid taking the usual course, the usual method of discussing about reckless land practices. I'm trying to differentiate, make the answer different, especially because these two cities are marked. So I've tried to focus my analysis in particular to the geography of these two regions. So in the initial line, we can talk about the general reasons like the reckless land development practices, then the development of concrete banks along nullas, then the illegal encroachments and the building of roads without any buffers with the fluid waters, then redirecting the water of the streams, then the silting of the rivers is there, then lack of preservation of wetlands. So these are the general reasons, but when we further elaborate upon the question, when we account basically we have to tell about the reasons. So when we come to Hyderabad, so Hyderabad is basically located in the Deccan region. So here, first of all, we can talk about the topography. Now here in Deccan region, the pattern of drainage is not dendritic as is found in the Himalayan drainage system. So the because of uneven slopes, the flow of rivers is haphazard. So that is topographical reason. Then we can talk about the illegal encroachments. That is a general. We can also write about that Hyderabad lies between two major basins, that is the Godavari basin and the Krishna basin, and roads have been constructed along rivers and streams without which surround the fluvial bodies without any buffer content available. So all these are the reasons. Then for Pune is actually located as in a saucer shaped type of topography. So basically a river, the infamous river here is Ambil Auda, which is mainly responsible for flash floods that are being caused in Pune in the recent times. So basically what is happening is Pune is surrounded by Katraj Hills. So Katraj Hills, first of all, Katraj Hills, the soil is very thin and loose, and it is also it consists of deciduous forests and such light vegetation. So when the rainfall occurs or water is released from the streams or the water flows in the streams, they are not adequately absorbed according to the low land capacity, and ultimately due to the diversion of the rivers and all such common factors also, this the lakes have been destroyed, siltation of lakes. So this extra water then causes flash floods in the cities of Pune. So again then we come to the mitigation measures. This is an important structure. We can write a lot of points in this. First we can write in general like climate assessment and drainage pattern. The weather patterns, drainage pattern should be they should be distributed publicly so that the preparations in advance in course of floods can be taken. Then in Pune and Hyderabad, instead of just concentrating on the catchment areas, we have to study the whole basin holistically, and in this we can take the help of Geographical Information System (GIS) and the latest technology. One of the government bodies is also creating an e-vulnerability atlas, so we can make use of that. Then the proper arrangements have to be made for groundwater recharge, so as to improve the capacity of the land to absorb the excess water. Then in Mumbai, the areas classified as a no development zone, such as the wetlands, ponds, lakes and streams, they have to be conserved, as they serve a vital as they protect us from floods. They provide a vital surface of absorbing excess water. Then we can give a case study. For example, in Gurugram also there is a project which is going on or in the process of commencement, that is Guru Jal project, because Gurugram is also prone to a lot of floods. And another other points we can also incorporate. So flooding is ultimately an adverse bane which has been affecting, and instead, in the conclusion, we can write that instead of treating it as a techno-managerial problem, we should treat this flooding problem as a socio-ecological problem and deal with it accordingly. So we come to the next question, that is India's immense potential of solar energy. Obviously, renewable sources of energy have been much of a talking point. So elaborate, explain. We have to delve into the question and give the basic points in support of the statements, and we have to again, regional variations are there. So in the introductory line we can write that India lies in the tropical belt and gets at least 300 days of solar radiation, that amounts to 2300 to 3000 hours of sunlight, which amounts to approximately 5000 trillion kilowatt hours of energy. So again, the potential of solar energy. Now in this question we can simply go about the stats. Okay, India gets this amount of kilowatt hours, but we have to the human aspects also, we have to diversify our question, the answer. So in this way we can start with, first of all, there is a great manufacturing potential with solar energy, as government is a monosoponist buyer, that is whatever is solar department is producing, whatever the common man or the manufacturer is producing, government is willing to buy all that and then further apply it. Then it has a great job creating potential. And further, once job creation is, once solar panel is set up or the solar power heater, solar cooker is set up, then the maintenance also requires personnel, and that recurrent jobs are there. Then we can also talk about the future prospects, that is India is India is supposed to achieve 8% of the total global capacity of solar power by 2035, and by that time it will reach a potential of 363 gigawatts. Then we can also write about the government initiatives, why and how government is incentivizing the production of solar panels and photovoltaic cells and is creating a huge solar potential. So we can talk about schemes such as KUSUM. KUSUM stands for Kisan Urja Suraksha Evam Utthan Mahabhiyan. So basically it is providing subsidies for the creation of lift irrigation systems and other farm equipment based on solar energy for the farmers, that is both standalone and also dependent upon the grid system, grid connected. Then Surya Mitra, under this scheme 50,000 workers or personnel are being trained for the maintenance and repair of the day-to-day functioning of the solar panels. And when we come to the regional variations, again we can observe that it depends upon various government initiatives, the policies, then the amount of sunlight, even the pollution. Recently I read in the news that dust is affecting the solar. Obviously the incoming solar radiation will be scattered by the dust particles. So in general we can write about, like we have in Andhra Pradesh. So Kurnool is a very good example of a solar power generation site. So in Kurnool, the Kurnool region also has hydroelectric power storage, apart from abundant sunshine, which also supports the round the clock generation of solar power. Now in places like Delhi, now Delhi is a very congested place, so wide spanning solar park or solar panels cannot be installed on a large scale. So basically it is concentrating more upon rooftop solar energy. Then we can talk about Maharashtra. In Maharashtra there is the Osmanabad region, which receives plenty of sunshine. It is in fact ranked third in the all the places in India which receives the the incumbent solar radiation. Then we can talk about Gujarat. There are various government initiatives. One of the largest solar parks in Asia we have in Patan district. And even there have been plans to develop the solar potential, the solar power panels or the solar parks in Ladakh region, because it is basically a lot of region in Ladakh is flat and it receives a lot of solar installation. So instead of getting going waste as albedo, it can be used in utilization. So solar energy basically we have also set our targets in the policies. So in this way we can write in 250 words easily, and we can conclude with a suitable conclusion. Okay, examine the forest resources and impact on climate change. Now this is an interesting question because we have to examine, actually we have to find out the truth behind the statement. When we are asked to examine, we have to consolidate our knowledge, we have to delve deeper into the question. Now although we can initiate the answer by writing that in the recent State of Forest reports of 2019, there is the total forest cover in India is about 21.67% of the total geographical area, as compared to 21.54% of total geographical area in 2017. Now on paper we can see that the total forest area as a percentage of TGA has increased, but when we examine it further we come across the following points. First of all, when we are talking about the total forest area, it also includes the open forest. Now open forest, it includes commercial plantations. Now this open forest area has grown considerably in the report, but this open forest area has come, the growth in the open forest area has come at the cost of moderately dense forest area, which is closer to human habitations. And then we talk about a very important category of forest, that is the VDS, very dense forests, and that these forests are classified by having canopy cover of greater than 70%. Now these forests are very important because these forests are they consume or they store the maximum amount of carbon from the atmosphere, from the global CO2. They are excellent carbon sinks, but in the present report they have increased by a marginal 1.14% as compared to the previous report. Now when we look at the report from 2015 to 2017, we have observed that the VDS increased by a considerable percentage. So in terms of developing a more qualified or a more effective carbon sink, we are still lagging behind. Then a cause for concern is the decline of forests in the northeastern region. All the states in the northeastern region have experienced forest loss except Assam by the extent of 18%. So all these factors have to be taken into account. Then we have to study about the impact on climate change. Obviously, when deforestation takes place, there has to be some sort of impact on the climate change. Now, northeastern monsoons this year were not satisfactory, and the deforestation or the subsidence of the forest, or the felling of the forest and trees, they were majorly attributed as the cause for the decline in the northeast monsoon. Then although forest fires are not exactly a consequence of the decline in forest, but it's a web or a cycle. For example, when we have deforestation, then it amplifies the prospects or the probability of forest fires. So there has been a spurt in the forest fires in the region of Uttarakhand, and that in turn releases carbon on a global scale. Then as deforestation takes place, the albedo of soil also increases, because sunshine or the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is not getting absorbed in the absorbed by the trees. So when the albedo increases, it again disintegrates, or it disturbs the regional solar radiation flux. And one of the noticeable changes which we are witnessing is the formation of clouds at a higher elevation as compared to the plains. This is also as a result of the deforestation, as it is disturbing the local or the regional climate. So in the conclusion, we can write that although the total carbon sink has become now 2147 million tons, and has increased by a certain quantity as compared relative to the previous assessment, but still we have to take formidable steps in order to attain or achieve our goal or commitment under the Paris Agreement of creation of 2.5 to 3 billion hectare tons, 3 billion hectare tons for for creation of the global sink. Again, we come to the cultural issues, the Indian society syllabus. Again, we have the justify, we have to take our stance, we have to ultimately create an equipoise solution. So we can ultimately start with the definition of globalization. That globalization is a complex series of political, social, cultural and economic changes which create interdependence and interconnectedness across several regions between the economic and human factors. So after that, we can take up several issues of pluralism. We have to tell whether the diversity and pluralism is under threat. So we can talk about again the economic development. Now when we talk about economic development, now English language, although it has created a dominant effect, and it has affected adversely the minority and the tribal and the other such undocumented languages, but on the other hand, on the same side, if we look at the positive side of globalization, it has also allowed the people to unify and use a common language, and they have helped in considerably in the advancement of the services sector in the economic development of our country. So these are both the pros and cons of economic development. Then we can now when we come to religious tolerance, we can see that with the advent of globalization, there has been increased response to material pursuits and commercialization. So there has been substantial reduction in the interreligious conflicts, but at the same time there has been a rise of nationalistic chauvinism. and religious fundamentalism in order to oppose the Western culture. Then we can talk about the performing arts. When we talk about performing arts, we can talk about the various classical music has become quite significant, has attained quite significance and become famous worldwide. At the same time, we are also influenced heavily by the Western music, so we are also drowning in the Western culture and we are forgetting about our own traditions and culture of our classical Hindustani and the Carnatic music. And otherwise also more Indian dance shows are being held outside, and the Indian musicians are preferring a fusion of the Indian and Western music, so that is that collaboration has led to a lot of advancements in music. Then we talk about visual arts. Now this in this mechanized and globalized world, what is happening, the local culture traditions of handicrafts and artisans are being affected. The cheap toys from countries like China flooding the markets, and they are affecting adversely. Then in a previous question we had taken an example of caste also. So again, caste is losing its relevance in a growing globalized society. People are working together, but at the same time political affiliations still exist. Then backward classes, the culture of the diversity of diversity and pluralism are still under threat with the persistence or the pervasiveness of casteism. So in this way we can also talk about racial diversity. Now certain monoculture has been in the trend recently. For example, people from different parts of the country are coming to Delhi or to study or find employment. They're going to Mumbai, but again in the garb of economic development. This is helping a lot of people to develop economically and socially, but at the same time we have seen instances of attacks on northeastern students, the Delhi University students, who have come from different states or different cultures. So that is again a negative aspect of globalization. So then we can this question can be explained in a lot of dimensions. I have discussed some of them. You can add other points also and give a conclusion. Now we have to provide an agreement or disagreement in this question. Basically, customs and traditions to obscurantism. Now this might seem like a complex word, obscurantism, but obscurantism is basically deliberately filling the minds of people, or deliberately promoting policies which prevent people to see the ideas or logic or facts behind a particular tradition or custom, and this prevents progress in the society. So that is the meaning of obscurantism. And basically two sides can be had to that, so we can consider it under different themes. So again we can talk about here medicine and health. Now recently in the news you might have read that the Ayush Ministry had collided head on with the Indian Medical Association, as it had given permission to the Ayurvedic students to conduct surgery, whereas the Indian Medical Association was arrogant. Not exactly arrogant, but it was bent upon the thing that surgeries should only be practiced by scientific medicine. Then we also have recently, we can talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. Now even after invoking the Health and the Epidemic Diseases Act, people were on a large scale, they were found flouting the rules in order to follow their customs, and they were found celebrating festivals, and they were found following their traditions of visiting religious places on a large scale. So this was at the cost of human health was neglected. So then we can talk about religious intolerance. This has been much in news now. Customs and traditions. Now we have come across several cases of mob lynching in the recent past, even on suspicions that a particular tradition or particular habit of the Western culture is causing sacrilege to the sacred traditions of a particular religion. Then we can the Charlie Hebdo case was much in picture. So this is the religious. Then we can talk about women empowerment. Although patriarchy is still prevalent, women are still held down. They are not given. There's a lot of gap between the wages of similar positions in the various companies on which the women occupy same positions. But at the same time, like traditions, there was a tradition in the armed forces that prevented, that construed the physical strength on the basis of the so-called physical strength of the women. They excluded the women from permanent commission. So we can talk about that. Then we can talk about the social acceptance. Now, social acceptance, now we have a very much talked about issue of transgenders. Transgenders still, it will take some time to accept them in the society. The tradition which people follow is that they don't fall into any so-called a particular category of, male and female, the two basic distinctions. So that is the case. And one recent much talked about case, although India has made significant steps to remedy the situation, but even in advanced countries like the US or Ireland, still abortion is considered unethical, as it amounts to sort of taking a life. So that is sort of a tradition. Then if we look at the positive side, that is when it is some traditions, some cultures in our society also deserve preservation. For example, the tradition of taking care of the elderly and following their culinary habits, so that is a good thing. Then recently, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, we resorted to the namaste in place of the handshake. That is a tradition of India which was lauded worldwide. Then we celebrate, yoga has acclaimed worldwide recognition, and we also have now the International Yoga Day. Then all these things we can write, and ultimately tradition is a belief that is passed among a group or society. It is based on particular concepts, and even custom is also behavior. When custom is passed, is repeated along generations, then ultimately it becomes a tradition. So in the end, you can conclude by saying, I remember a quote by Mahatma Gandhi, that it is it is okay to swim with the trends of tradition, but it is to sink in the tradition is suicide. So traditions are something which continuously need to evolve with the social structure and the present need of the time. Now again, digital initiatives. Again, this question shows that although I don't see a real connection with the GS1 syllabus, but I see more of its connection as education and is in paper GS paper 2, and digital technology is in GS paper 3. But still, this question proves that the UPSC is doing away with the distinctions, or it is concentrating more upon overlapping or making things common, and relating the papers with each other. So again, digital initiatives in the field of education have been trending and given impetus since a long time, but still in the wake of the recent COVID pandemic, they have assumed relatively more significance. So some initiatives, like one of the initiative, I'm talking about this, digital board, the smart board. So this is a innovation digital initiative. There's some government initiatives we can talk about is the Diksha. And Diksha, when we expand the abbreviation, the digital information and knowledge systems, digital information knowledge sharing. So here it is a part of the PM E-Vidya scheme under the Atmanirbhar Abhiyan. So here it is a web portal, basically the internet, through the internet connections available, we can have the students, teachers and other educators, the academicians, they can access the online resources, and it can also be used to teach the students from class 1 to 12th. Now again, like in the earlier COVID-19 pandemic question, we talked about how many households still don't have access to internet connection. So what about them? There we have a Swayam portal in which the resources are available online, and although in this scheme, what the government has done, it has connected, it has tied up with the DTH services like Airtel and Tata Sky, so they can be directly aired through the TV channels and given access to students and teachers. Then we have the NROER, the National Repository of Open Educational Resources. So here also it is a sort of a web portal which can be accessed through mobile applications, and a lot of NCERT content is available on this portal, and this is an open source and it can be accessed easily. Then for the disabled sector, the visually and hearing impaired, we have the DAISY, that is a digitally accessible information systems. So we make use of innovative methods and devices which help in the you can elaborate on that, and this system helps the handicapable to fulfill their dreams of education. Then we have the massive online open courses, that is for the NIOS curriculum. So that is basically for classes 9 to 12. A lot of content has been uploaded. Nearly 1.5 crore students have already enrolled in this scheme. So these things can be elaborated. These are the basic main digital initiatives. And in order to give a concluding statement, we can say that although these digital initiatives are much appreciated, but we still have to take formidable, we have to take concrete steps, so that this can amplify or augment or supplement the face-to-face education which used to take in the recent past. So it can not exactly substitute, but it can in a way advance the face-to-face education. So this was the last question. So at the end, I hope you had an enlightening session as much as I enjoyed giving this session, although I am quite exhausted. But it was a real revelation for me also. It was a good experience. So all of you are welcome to share your feedback on this analysis, and this will enable me to further improve upon my further analysis. Maybe I'll present an analysis in front of you for GS paper 2. They will mainly discuss about the polity and international relations. So till then, I hope you benefit from this video, and we'll see you again later. Thank you.